Officer Mark Reed stood at the checkpoint in Oak Grove, the predominantly black neighborhood of Millbrook City, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt while he surveyed the modest homes through mirrored sunglasses, his contempt visible in the tight line of his mouth. These routine checks were his favorite way to assert control, though he'd never admit that openly to anyone but his closest colleagues. The houses along the street were well maintained, with neat lawns and clean porches, a fact that seemed to irritate him even more. His partner, Officer Jenkins, was checking documents from a beaten-up Honda while Mark kept watch, cataloging every detail that reinforced his prejudices. A group of teenagers crossed the street to avoid the checkpoint, and Mark smirked. "These people," he muttered, watching them hurry past. "Always something to hide." He made mental notes of their faces, convinced they'd appear in a report eventually. The weight of his badge felt heavy against his chest, not as a symbol of protection, but as a shield for his authority. A silver Buick Century approached the checkpoint. Behind the wheel sat Clara Williams, her gray hair neatly styled, wearing a pressed floral dress that spoke of a lifetime of dignity. She slowed her car to a stop, placing her hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit born from decades of similar encounters. Mark approached the driver's side, his boots scraping against the pavement with deliberate slowness. He skipped the customary greeting he used in other neighborhoods. "License and registration," he barked, leaning down to peer into the car, his hand resting on his weapon. Clara reached for her documents with measured movements. "Of course, officer," she replied, her voice carrying a gentle southern lilt. She maintained eye contact as she handed over her papers, her composure seemingly irritating Mark further. The interaction quickly deteriorated. Mark's questions became increasingly aggressive, his tone sharp with barely concealed hostility. "Where are you coming from? Where are you heading? Why are you in this neighborhood?" Each question came rapid fire, not waiting for complete answers. Clara's responses remained steady and dignified, but Mark sensed what he interpreted as defiance in her calm demeanor. His face flushed with anger as she explained she lived in the neighborhood and was returning from church council meetings. The situation escalated when Clara politely asked why she was being detained for so long. Mark's control snapped. He yanked the car door open, ordering her to step out. When Clara asked for clarification, he grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her from the vehicle. The violence happened quickly. Mark shoved Clara against her car, ignoring her age and dignity. Her head hit the roof with a dull thud. Onlookers gasped and pulled out phones, recording the incident as Mark twisted her arm behind her back, pressing her against the vehicle with unnecessary force. What Mark couldn't know, was that Clara Williams was no ordinary elderly resident. Her composed expression masked years of undercover work as an FBI agent. As her cheek pressed against the hot metal of her car, she mentally recorded every detail of the encounter, every excessive use of force, every violation of protocol. This wasn't just another case of police brutality. This was the moment that would unravel everything Mark Reed thought he knew about power, about control, and about the people he was sworn to protect, but chose to terrorize instead. Inside the local FBI field office, Clara Williams sat calmly in a conference room, her floral dress now wrinkled from the earlier assault. Her supervisor, Agent Thompson, paced the room, while other agents reviewed the footage captured by bystanders. The bruises forming on Clara's arm told their own story of Officer Reed's brutality. "This wasn't part of the original investigation scope," Thompson said, running a hand through his graying hair. "But it might be exactly what we needed," Clara nodded, applying a cold compress to her shoulder. Her 6-month undercover operation investigating police corruption had just taken an unexpected turn. "Reed's actions fit the pattern we've been tracking," Clara stated, her voice steady despite the day's events. "But this time, he picked the wrong target." She pulled out her notebook, where she documented every detail of the encounter with professional precision. The room fell silent as she began sharing her observations. Meanwhile, across town, the video of Clara's assault spread like wildfire through social media. Local news stations picked up the story. Elderly church leader assaulted by police officer. What started as whispers in Oak Grove quickly became shouts across the city. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct within hours. Their signs told stories of other incidents, other victims. But Clara's face became the rallying point. Justice for Clara echoed through the streets, accompanied by demands for accountability and reform. Inside the precinct, Mark Reed sat in his captain's office, watching the crowds grow through Venetian blinds. His usual confidence wavered as his captain played the viral video again. Each frame showed his actions in unforgiving detail. The aggressive approach, the unnecessary force, the complete disregard for Clara's age and dignity. "What were you thinking, Reed?" the captain demanded, pausing the video at the moment Mark slammed Clara against her car. Mark shifted in his seat, his excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. "She was being uncooperative," he muttered, but the words felt weak. The captain tossed a preliminary report on the desk between them. "She's a respected community member with no record. You had no probable cause for the stop, let alone the use of force." Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder. Mark's phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, some offering support, others distancing themselves as the public relations nightmare unfolded. Internal Affairs had already scheduled an interview for the following morning. Clara used the growing unrest strategically. Her FBI team monitored social media, gathering evidence of similar incidents, building a broader case against the department's systemic issues. What started as an investigation into corruption was evolving into something bigger, a chance to expose the deep-rooted problems within the force. The evening news showed split screens, Clara's bruised face on one side, Mark's official police photograph on the other. Political figures began issuing statements. The mayor called for a thorough investigation. The police union prepared their standard defense. But this time felt different. The public wasn't accepting the usual excuses. Mark drove home that night through back streets, avoiding the protests. His certainty about his actions, about his role, about everything he thought he knew, began to crack. He didn't yet know Clara's true identity, but he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, his carefully constructed world beginning to unravel. Sarah Reed sat in her home office, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face as she watched the video for the 20th time. Her legal training kicked in automatically, cataloging each violation of protocol, each abuse of power, each moment her husband transformed from a police officer into everything she fought against in court. The woman's face, Clara Williams, haunted her. Sarah had defended civil rights cases for years, but this felt different. This wasn't just another case file. This was her husband's hands gripping an elderly woman's arms, her husband's voice shouting unnecessary commands, her husband becoming the very thing she despised. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. Colleagues from the ACLU, fellow civil rights attorneys, journalists seeking comments. She'd ignored them all, sitting in stunned silence as her personal and professional lives collided catastrophically. Mark's heavy footsteps on the stairs announced his arrival home. Sarah closed her laptop but didn't turn around. The tension filled the room like smoke, making it hard to breathe. "Want to explain what I just watched?" she asked, her voice carrying the quiet intensity she usually reserved for cross-examinations. "You don't understand what it's like out there," Mark began, using the same defensive tone she'd heard him use in her courtroom. Sarah spun her chair around, fixing him with a stare that had made corrupt officials squirm. "Don't you dare," she cut him off. "I've spent my career defending people against exactly what you did today. Tell me, what threat did she pose? What crime did you suspect her of, other than existing while black in what you consider your territory?" Mark's face reddened. "You're taking their side? I'm your husband. And she's a human being, Mark. A citizen you swore to protect. Did you even ask for her name before you put your hands on her?" Their argument escalated, years of unspoken tensions surfacing. Sarah's cases, the ones Mark had dismissed as troublemaker suits, now stood as evidence of everything she'd tried to tell him. Each victory she'd won against police brutality, each settlement she'd secured for victims, all of it had fallen on deaf ears at home. Meanwhile, across town, Clara stood before a growing crowd in Oak Grove Community Park. Her bruises were visible, but her voice was strong. She spoke about dignity, about justice, about the daily reality of being Black in America. The crowd grew as she spoke, people drawn by the power of her words and the undeniable truth of her experience. "This isn't about one incident or one officer," Clara declared, her voice carrying across the park. "This is about a system that enables abuse, that protects those who should be protecting us. But we will not be silent. We will not be afraid." The crowd's response was electric. White, Black, young, old. They stood together, united by Clara's words and the undeniable evidence of injustice captured on video. Local news cameras captured every moment, broadcasting her speech live across the city. Sarah watched the coverage on her phone, tears streaming down her face as Mark stormed out of the house. Clara's words echoed everything she'd fought for in court, everything she'd tried to explain to her husband. The gap between them, always present but ignored, now seemed unbridgeable. The protest march filled Main Street with a sea of signs and determined faces. Clara Williams walked at its heart, her steps measured and purposeful. She'd traded her church dress for a simple suit, projecting the quiet authority that had served her well throughout her career. What the crowd didn't know was that she was carefully observing everything. Faces in windows, officers on the periphery, the subtle dynamics of power playing out in real time. Sarah Reed stood on the sidelines, watching the procession with a lawyer's eye. She recognized many faces from her cases, victims of the system she'd represented over the years. Her wedding ring felt heavy on her finger as she thought of Mark, who hadn't come home last night after their argument. Taking a deep breath, she stepped off the curb and approached Clara. "Mrs. Williams?" Sarah's voice carried over the chants. "I'm Sarah Reed. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I'm Officer Reed's wife." The last words caught in her throat, but she forced them out. She owed Clara that much honesty. Clara turned, studying Sarah with eyes that missed nothing. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications. Then Clara nodded, gesturing to a quieter spot away from the main crowd. "I've heard of your work, Mrs. Reed. You've done a lot of good for this community. Please call me Sarah." She glanced at Clara's bruised arm, visible beneath her sleeve. "I want to help. Not as Mark's wife, but as someone who believes in justice. What he did, there's no excuse." Clara considered Sarah's words carefully. Her FBI training had taught her to read people, to spot sincerity among lies. She saw genuine anguish in Sarah's eyes, recognized the courage it took to approach her so publicly. "Your husband," Clara began, watching Sarah's reaction, "is a symptom of a larger disease. But having you here, choosing justice over loyalty to a broken system, that's part of the cure." Mark watched the exchange from his patrol car parked 2 blocks away, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The sight of his wife standing with Clara sent waves of confusion and anger through him. On his dashboard, his phone displayed dozens of missed calls from fellow officers, some supportive, others demanding he keep his woman in line. The conversation between Clara and Sarah continued, moving from the immediate crisis to deeper issues. Sarah shared stories from her cases, patterns of abuse she'd documented over years. Clara listened intently, filing away details that could prove useful to her investigation, while genuine respect grew between them. "We need more than just protests," Sarah explained, her legal mind already formulating strategies. We need systematic change, documentation, legal pressure. The system protects itself unless we force transparency. And are you prepared for what that might reveal? Clara asked, thinking of her FBI case files, the corruption she'd been tracking. About the department? About your husband? Sarah straightened her spine, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw determination. The truth matters more than my marriage right now. Whatever we find, the public deserves to know. From his vantage point, Mark watched his personal and professional worlds colliding. The wife who had defended thugs in court was now standing with the woman who'd destroyed his reputation. His certainties were crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of isolation. In a quiet coffee shop away from prying eyes, Clara and Sarah spread documents across a corner table. Sarah's legal files detailed years of police misconduct cases, while Clara carefully shared selective information about department patterns. Nothing that would compromise her FBI cover, but enough to paint a disturbing picture. Look at these clusters. Sarah pointed to a map she'd created, showing incident locations. It's not random. Certain officers, certain neighborhoods, certain times of day. Your incident with Mark fits right into the pattern. Clara nodded, thinking of the broader FBI investigation she couldn't yet reveal. The culture of silence protects them. Officers who speak up disappear from the force, while the worst offenders get promoted. Meanwhile, at the police department, Mark sat through another internal affairs interview. The investigator, Lieutenant Martinez, closed a thick folder and leaned back. You're not making this easy, Reed. The footage is clear. The public's outraged. The department needs someone to blame. So I'm the sacrificial lamb? Mark's voice rose. After everything I've done for this department? The arrests, the quotas, the special assignments? He caught himself too late, realizing he'd said too much. Martinez's expression shifted subtly. What special assignments, Officer Reed? Before Mark could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Officer Wilson. Keep your mouth shut. Meeting tonight. Usual place. Mark felt sweat forming on his forehead as he mumbled an excuse about routine patrols to Martinez. Back at the coffee shop, Clara received an encrypted message from her FBI team. They'd intercepted communications, suggesting a network of officers involved in evidence tampering, excessive force cover-ups, and possibly worse. Mark's name appeared repeatedly in their surveillance. Sarah was explaining her reform proposal when Clara's expression changed. What is it? Sarah asked, recognizing the look of someone who'd just received significant information. Your husband, Clara chose her words carefully, might be involved in something bigger than the assault. Have you noticed anything unusual? Large cash deposits? Late-night meetings? Sarah's legal training kicked in. Memories surfacing of unexplained absences, mysterious phone calls, and cash Mark claimed came from overtime. She'd never questioned it, maintaining the deliberate blindness that had preserved their marriage. There's a group, Sarah said slowly, that meets at O'Malley's bar. Mark thinks I don't know, but I followed him once. Senior officers, some politicians, always in the back room. Clara made a mental note, matching this information with FBI surveillance. Sarah, what I'm about to tell you stays between us. Your husband and his friends aren't just corrupt cops. They're organized, protected, and dangerous. The weight of this revelation settled over their table. Sarah thought of her comfortable life, built on willful ignorance of her husband's activities. Whatever you need, she said firmly. Whatever evidence you're gathering, I want to help. No more looking the other way. As they talked, Mark entered O'Malley's bar's back room. A dozen officers waited, led by Captain Richards, known on the street as the Fixer. The atmosphere was tense, electric with suppressed violence. Your wife's becoming a problem, Richards stated flatly. And this Williams woman? She needs to back off. We've worked too hard, built too much, to let it fall apart now. Mark felt the noose tightening around his neck. He'd always been a willing participant in the department's darker activities, but now he was becoming a liability. His assault on Clara had brought unwanted attention, and his wife's involvement threatened everything. The internal affairs interrogation room felt smaller than ever as Lieutenant Martinez laid out the evidence against Mark. Surveillance photos showed him at O'Malley's with known corrupt officers. Bank records revealed unexplained deposits. Body camera footage, mysteriously lost from previous incidents, had suddenly resurfaced. "Want to explain these deposits, Officer Reed?" Martinez pushed a bank statement across the table. "Or should we discuss the missing evidence from the Johnson case? Maybe the Thompson arrest? Your assault on Mrs. Williams opened a door we can't close anymore." Mark's practiced excuses crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence. Each lie he told was met with contradicting documentation. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from Captain Richards and others, demanding his silence. But their threats felt hollow against the mounting evidence. Across town, Sarah sat in a packed auditorium at the Civil Rights Conference, watching Clara take the stage. The elderly woman who had been Mark's victim now commanded the room with quiet authority. Camera crews lined the walls, broadcasting live across the state. "Systemic corruption," Clara began, her voice steady, "isn't just about bad officers. It's about the good ones who stay silent, the wives who don't ask questions, the supervisors who look the other way." Her eyes met Sarah's in the audience. But silence is no longer an option. Mark watched the broadcast from the precinct break room, surrounded by increasingly hostile colleagues. Clara's words cut through his defenses, forcing him to confront truths he'd spent years denying. On the screen, he saw his wife in the front row, nodding at Clara's every word. "The blue wall of silence," Clara continued, "protects criminals wearing badges. It turns good officers into accomplices. It corrupts the very institutions sworn to protect and serve." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But that wall is cracking." Sarah felt tears rolling down her face as Clara spoke. Years of defending civil rights cases while making excuses for her husband's behavior crashed down around her. She thought of the files in her office, the patterns she'd ignored, the signs she'd dismissed. Clara's presentation included redacted documents suggesting widespread corruption. Though she couldn't reveal her FBI role, each piece of evidence pointed to a larger conspiracy. In the audience, several officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own misdeeds in the patterns she described. "This isn't just about one assault," Clara declared. "It's about a system that rewards brutality, protects corruption, and punishes those who speak up. Officer Reed's attack on me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a poisoned culture." Mark felt the eyes of his fellow officers on him. Some looked away, others glared openly. His phone buzzed again. Captain Richards wanted another meeting, but Mark knew the game was changing. The protected circles he'd moved in were dissolving under the spotlight Clara had created. As Clara concluded her speech, Sarah stood with the thunderous applause. She'd made her choice. Looking at her wedding ring one last time, she slipped it off and into her pocket. There would be no more compromises, no more looking the other way. In a dimly lit corner of O'Malley's bar, Officer Wilson leaned across the table toward Mark, his voice barely above a whisper. "Listen, Reed, we can still contain this. Richards has judges in his pocket, dirt on the DA. Just keep your mouth shut and let the system work." Mark stared into his untouched whiskey, seeing his reflection fractured in the amber liquid. "The system's failing, Tom. You've seen the evidence they have. Martinez knows about the money, the covered-up incidents, everything." "Since when did you grow a conscience?" Wilson sneered. "Remember that drug bust last year? The evidence that disappeared? The cash we split? You were happy enough then." He pulled out his phone, showing Mark photos of himself at various scenes, damning evidence of past misconduct. We protect our own, but that protection works both ways. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her FBI office, reviewing Mark's complete file. Beyond the assault on her, a pattern emerged. Excessive force complaints mysteriously dropped, witnesses changing statements, evidence vanishing from lockup. Each incident connected to larger corruption schemes she'd been investigating. "Look at this," she told her supervisor, spreading out surveillance photos. "Reed's not just a racist cop who lost control. He's been their enforcer, their muscle. When they need evidence to disappear or witnesses to stay quiet, he's their go-to man." The photos showed Mark at multiple scenes: late-night meetings with known drug dealers, exchanges in parking lots, conversations with judges who later dismissed cases against corrupt officers. His brutality wasn't random. It was a tool used by the department to maintain control. Sarah, working late in her law office, discovered similar patterns in her old case files. Cases against officers that seemed solid, suddenly dismissed. Witnesses who changed testimonies after visits from certain officers, including her husband. The truth she'd avoided for years now screamed from every page. Her phone rang. It was Mark. "Sarah, please." His voice cracked. "You have to understand. Everything I did for us, for our future." "No." Sarah's voice was ice. "You did it for power, for control. How many lives have you destroyed, Mark? How many people have suffered while I defended you at dinner parties, made excuses for your tough job?" "They're going to bring me down," Mark warned. "Everything will come out. Your career, our life together." "Our life together was built on lies," Sarah cut him off. "I've requested all your case files where I represented the other side. Every hearing where I defended victims against officers like you. I'm reviewing everything, Mark. Everything." Clara's team had bugged O'Malley's bar months ago. She listened to Mark's conversation with Wilson, documenting every threat, every admission. The net was tightening, but she knew cornered animals were the most dangerous. As night fell, Sarah discovered a locked drawer in Mark's home office. Inside, she found notebooks detailing years of corruption, dates, amounts, names of officers involved. Her husband hadn't just participated in the corruption. He'd documented it, creating insurance against betrayal. The evidence she held could bring down half the department. But as she photographed each page, Sarah knew she was crossing a line that would change everything. Her hands shook, but her resolve was firm. The city council chamber was packed for the public hearing. Clara stood at the podium, her FBI badge finally displayed openly, as she methodically presented evidence of departmental corruption. The projection screen behind her displayed documents, photographs, and transcripts that made the truth undeniable. "Over the past 6 months," Clara announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room, "our investigation has uncovered systematic abuse of power, evidence tampering, and organized corruption within the police department." She clicked through slides showing surveillance photos, bank records, and transcribed conversations. Gasps filled the room as familiar faces appeared on screen: judges, politicians, high-ranking officers. In the back, several officers quietly stood and left, their expressions dark. Mark sat rigid in his seat, watching his world collapse as Clara revealed the extent of their surveillance. "Officer Mark Reed's assault on me wasn't random," Clara continued. "It was a symptom of a culture that encouraged violence, protected abusers, and silenced victims." She played the audio from O'Malley's bar, Mark's conversations with Wilson echoing through the chamber. Mark approached the podium next, his uniform pressed, but his face haggard. He'd prepared a statement defending his actions, claiming misunderstandings and exaggerated accusations. But facing the evidence, facing Clara, his rehearsed words felt hollow. "I was following orders," he began weakly. The audience's hostile murmurs grew louder. We were maintaining order, doing what needed to be done. Even to his own ears, the excuses sounded pathetic. Sarah watched from her seat beside Clara, her face set in stone as her husband attempted to justify years of corruption and violence. When Mark's eyes met hers, pleading for support, she stared back unflinching. "Order?" came a shout from the audience. "By beating elderly women? By planting evidence? By terrorizing our communities?" More voices joined in, years of suppressed anger finally finding release. Mark's composure cracked. "You don't understand what it's like out there, the pressure, the expectations." His voice rose, becoming defensive, aggressive. The very behavior that had exposed him now betrayed him again. Clara stood calmly as Mark's justifications devolved into barely concealed racism and accusations. Every word he spoke only reinforced the evidence against him, against the department, against the system he represented. The community had mobilized in force. The chamber overflowed with citizens demanding change, their signs visible through the windows. Local news crews broadcast live, ensuring every word was documented. When Mark finally fell silent, Clara approached the podium again. "This isn't just about punishment," she declared. "This is about transformation, about building a system that truly serves and protects all citizens, regardless of their color or neighborhood." Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Signs bearing Clara's image mixed with demands for justice and reform. The blue wall of silence was crumbling, and in its ruins lay the possibility of real change. The protests that filled Central Square marked a turning point. Thousands gathered, their voices united in demands for justice. Clara and Sarah stood at the front, no longer adversaries or symbols, but partners in the fight for change. The police presence was heavy, officers lining the perimeter with barely concealed tension. "We've lived under this system for too long." Clara's voice carried over the crowd through speakers. "Today, we don't just demand change, we ensure it." Behind her, a massive screen displayed evidence of corruption, each image a testament to years of abuse and cover-ups. Mark stood with the line of officers, stripped of his badge, but required to attend as part of the investigation. Every face in the crowd seemed to accuse him. Every chant highlighted his crimes. His former colleagues had created distance between them, leaving him isolated in his shame. Sarah took the microphone next, her professional composure masking personal pain. "As an attorney, I defended civil rights while ignoring violations in my own home. That complicity ends today." She locked eyes with Mark across the square. No more silence, no more excuses. The crowd's energy shifted as Marcus Johnson, a young black man, approached the microphone. His brother had died in police custody last year, a case Mark had helped cover up. "Officer Reed," he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. "You remember my brother?" Mark's face drained of color as Marcus described the night his brother died. The evidence that disappeared, the witnesses who were threatened. Each word struck like a physical blow, stripping away Mark's remaining defenses. "You didn't just kill my brother," Marcus continued, tears streaming down his face. "You killed the truth. You killed justice. You killed our faith in the system you swore to uphold." The crowd's anger was palpable, pressing against the police line. Several officers removed their badges, stepping away from their positions to join the protesters. The symbolic gesture sent ripples through both sides of the divide. Clara watched as the moment teetered between chaos and transformation. Her FBI training had taught her to read crowds, to sense the pivotal moments that could turn protest into progress or disaster. "Channel this anger into action," she called out. "We have evidence. We have testimony. We have the power to change the system, not just fight it." Her words caught the crowd's attention, redirecting their energy from pure anger to purposeful determination. Mark felt the weight of every accusation, every revealed crime, every life he'd helped destroy. The righteousness he'd hidden behind for years crumbled, leaving him exposed to the truth of his actions. In the faces before him, he finally saw people, not threats, not statistics, but human beings he'd sworn to protect and failed. The protest continued into the evening, peaceful but powerful. Each speaker brought new evidence, new stories, new demands for change. The wall of silence that had protected corrupt officers for so long was being dismantled, brick by brick, in full public view. 3 months after the protest, Clara and Sarah stood before the State Justice Committee. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation as they presented their comprehensive report on police corruption. Television cameras broadcast live across the nation, making history in real time. What began with an assault, Clara testified, her FBI credentials prominently displayed, led us to uncover one of the largest police corruption scandals in state history. She methodically presented evidence, financial records, surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and Mark's own detailed notebooks. Sarah followed with legal documentation. Over the past decade, this corruption has cost taxpayers millions in settlements while destroying countless lives in our communities. Her voice remained steady as she outlined cases she'd fought, now seen in a new light with evidence from Mark's files. Meanwhile, Mark sat in a holding cell awaiting his arraignment. The evidence against him had proved overwhelming. His former colleagues had turned on him, offering testimonies in exchange for lighter sentences. Captain Richards, Officer Wilson, and several others had already pleaded guilty to various charges. Mark Reed wasn't just a violent officer, the prosecutor announced at his hearing. He was a key enforcer in a criminal enterprise operating under the color of law. The charges were extensive: assault, evidence tampering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and more. Clara's investigative team had uncovered millions in stolen drug money, countless cases of evidence tampering, and a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government. Judges were resigning, politicians were facing indictments, and the police department was undergoing a complete overhaul. Sarah's law firm now led a class action lawsuit representing victims of police brutality and corruption. The settlement discussions involved not just monetary compensation, but systematic changes: civilian oversight, mandatory body cameras, transparent disciplinary procedures, and community involvement in police training. The reforms Clara and Sarah had conceived months ago in that coffee shop were becoming reality. The state legislature passed the Williams-Reed Act, named for the unlikely partnership between an FBI agent and a civil rights attorney that had exposed the truth. Mark's sentencing hearing brought final justice. As he stood before the judge, the man who had once wielded power so brutally now appeared small, broken. Clara sat in the gallery, her presence a reminder of where it all began. "Your Honor," Mark spoke, his voice barely audible, "I can't undo what I've done. I became the very thing I claimed to be fighting against. I betrayed my badge, my community, and everyone who trusted me." The judge's sentence was severe: 20 years in federal prison. As Mark was led away, Sarah watched from beside Clara, her wedding ring long gone, replaced by a commitment to justice that would define her future work. Clara's FBI task force expanded, taking their investigation model nationwide. Other departments began internal reviews, fearing they might be next. The blue wall of silence was cracking across the country. In Oak Grove, where it all began, a new police chief worked with community leaders to rebuild trust. Young officers underwent training that emphasized protection over power, service over force. Clara's assault, captured on video months ago, became a teaching tool about what law enforcement should never be. "This isn't the end," Clara told reporters after Mark's sentencing. "It's a beginning. Real change takes time, vigilance, and continuous effort. But for the first time in decades, we've proven that justice is possible." Sarah stood beside her, adding, "The system doesn't change itself. It changes when we force it to face its failures and commit to genuine reform. Today, we've shown that no one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. The story of Clara Williams and the fall of Mark Reed became more than a case of police brutality. It became a blueprint for exposing corruption, a testament to the power of unlikely allies, and proof that even the most entrenched systems can be changed when truth refuses to remain silent.